"I shall never love her," the Marquess said, but his heart broke to see her with another. Welcome, dear viewer, to another narrative that crosses time to touch hearts in the present. Today, I invite you to delve into a story about invisible walls, those we erect to protect ourselves, but which ultimately imprison us. It speaks of the fear of loving, of old wounds that bleed in silence, and of the courage needed to tear down, stone by stone, the fortresses we build around the heart. This is the story of Charlotte and Henry, two souls destined to meet, separated by pride, by fear, and by the conventions of an era that measured people's worth by the weight of their titles and the thickness of their wallets. But above all, it is a story about second chances, about love that persists even when everything conspires against it, about the dignity of those who love in silence and the redemption of those who learn, albeit belatedly, to open the doors they have kept locked for decades. Before we begin, I would like to know, where are you following this story from? Which city, which corner of the world are you listening to me from right now? Leave a comment. I love knowing where the souls that connect with these narratives come from. And if this story touches you in any way, if the words find an echo in your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Every subscription, every like, is an incentive for me to continue bringing stories like this, stories that remind us that no matter the era, the human heart always beats to the same rhythm when it finds true love. Now, settle in, take a deep breath. Let the words transport you to another time, another place. Year 1881. Location London, England, Victorian era. Reign of Queen Victoria. In an era when ballrooms were stages for matrimonial negotiations, where every waltz carried the weight of fortunes and reputations, where a lady's silence could mean as much as 1,000 words. In an era such as this, true love was considered a luxury for fools and poets. But there are hearts that insist on being foolish. There are souls that, even surrounded by conventions and rules, find ways to recognize each other across a crowded room. And there are stories that need to be told, because they remind us that we have always been, in essence, the same, beings in search of connection, of belonging, of someone who looks at us and sees not what we appear to be, but who we truly are. This is one of those stories. The Duchess of Devonshire's ballroom glowed that April night like a palace of crystal and gold. The 12th of April, 1881. The date would be etched into Lady Charlotte Ashford's memory like a branding iron, marking the exact moment when something inside her broke without a sound. The chandeliers spilled golden light over hundreds of guests dressed in silks and velvets. The scent of fresh flowers, white lilies and hothouse roses, mingled with the imported perfume of the ladies and the discreet smell of cigars escaping from the gaming room. It was the opening of the social season, and all of London seemed to have converged on that Mayfair address. Charlotte stood by one of the tall windows, observing the dark garden outside. At 24, she had already navigated 5 London seasons, 5 springs of balls, soirees, operas and strolls in Hyde Park. 2 marriage proposals had been refused, not out of caprice, but from a silent conviction that matrimony should be more than a commercial transaction wrapped in white lace. Her navy blue gown, embroidered with small pearls on the bodice, was elegant without being ostentatious. Her brown hair, pulled up in an elaborate arrangement, allowed a few rebellious strands to frame her delicate features. There was something in her eyes, the color of dark honey, that suggested depth, like still waters hiding currents. She did not seek Henry Blackwell with her eyes. She did not need to. She knew exactly where he was, near the main drawing-room fireplace, conversing with Lord Pemberton about matters that certainly involved horses or country estates. She felt his presence as if an invisible cord connected them, vibrating with his every movement across the room. They had met 7 times since January, 7 encounters that, by the standards of Victorian society, already constituted matter for speculation. The first, at a musical soiree at the Pembertons' house, when his eyes, green as old forest moss, met hers across a sea of unknown faces. Then a casual meeting at the National Gallery, where they discussed Turner for almost an hour, oblivious to the world around them. And then the Marlborough Ball, where they waltzed 3 times, 2 more than decorum allowed. Charlotte was not naive. She knew the whispers followed her down the corridors of the salons. "Ashford's daughter is chasing the Duke of Ravenswood," they said. "Poor thing, doesn't she know he will never marry?" She heard and pretended not to hear, because there was something in Henry's glances, something in the silences between their words, that told her a different truth. or so she thought. Lady Constance Whitmore's voice cut through the murmur of conversations like a sharp blade. Charlotte did not need to turn around to know that the woman had approached Henry with all the subtlety of a vulture circling carrion. "Duke of Ravenswood," the sharp voice carried that tone of false sweetness that precedes poison. "The rumors are absolutely delicious this season. They say a certain young lady has shown a particular interest in your person. An interest that borders on desperation. If you allow me the frankness." The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Charlotte felt the blood freeze in her veins. Her fingers clenched her fan hard enough to break the ivory sticks. And then Henry's voice, that deep voice that had made her tremble so many times, replied with a coldness she had never heard. "Lady Charlotte is perfectly acceptable as an acquaintance, but I assure you, there is no connection between us, nor will there be." A pause. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. "I could never love her." 5 words. Only 5 words, spoken with the same indifference one might comment on the weather or the dinner menu. 5 words that crossed the room, found Charlotte by the window, and embedded themselves in her chest like shards of glass. She did not move. She showed no reaction whatsoever. Years of training in composure, the legacy of generations of Ashford women who learned to bleed internally without shedding a single public tear, manifested at that instant. Her face remained serene, a perfect mask of aristocratic indifference. Inside, something shattered. Charlotte raised her chin slightly, a gesture her mother had taught her even before she learned to walk, crossed the room with measured steps, and joined Lady Dorothea, who was waiting for her near the refreshments table. Mother and daughter exchanged a look that dispensed with words. There was understanding there, and there was pain, and there was that silent strength women learn to cultivate when the world insists on breaking them. "Let us go home, Mamma," Charlotte murmured, and her voice did not tremble. The Ashfords' carriage departed before midnight. Through the window, Charlotte watched the lights of London recede. Blurred by tears, she finally allowed herself to shed. She did not cry for the public humiliation. She would recover from that. She cried for what might have been, for the gardens they would never walk together, for the conversations about art and philosophy they would never have again, for the future she had dared to imagine and which now lay in ruins. What Charlotte did not know, what she could not know, was that at that very moment Henry Blackwell remained by the drawing-room fireplace, his fists clenched inside his white gloves, his face turned to stone. That behind his cruel words was an ancient terror, a ghost that had haunted him since he was 14, when he found his father's body in the Ravenswood Castle library, a blood-stained letter on the desk. What Charlotte did not know was that Henry loved her, and that it was precisely for that reason he needed to push her away, because in the Blackwell family, to love meant to destroy, and he would never allow Charlotte to pay the price his mother had exacted from his father. That night, as the Ashford carriage crossed the sleepy streets of London, 2 souls bled in silence. Separated by conventions, by fears, by wounds, neither knew how to heal. And in the offices of lawyer Bartholomew Crane, a letter awaited Lady Charlotte, with news that would turn her situation from painful to desperate. The Ashford family was on the brink of financial ruin. Mr. Bartholomew Crane's office smelled of old paper and iron gall ink. Dark oak shelves lined every wall, crammed with leather-bound volumes that seemed not to have been touched in decades. The light entering through the single window was filtered by heavy curtains, lending the environment a perpetual gloom that matched the gravity of the news communicated there. Charlotte sat in the straight-backed chair, her gloved hands resting on her lap in perfect composure. Her mother, Lady Dorothea, occupied the chair beside her, her pale face accentuated by the half-mourning black dress she still wore in memory of her husband. Mr. Crane cleaned his spectacles with an ink-stained handkerchief before beginning to speak. His words were precise, devoid of flourish, as befitted a man who had spent 40 years translating human tragedies into legal terms. The debts totaled £4,500. The mortgage on Ashford Manor would expire in October. The late Earl's investments in Indian Railways had collapsed spectacularly, taking with them what remained of the family patrimony. In practical terms, if nothing were done, the Ashfords would lose the estate that had belonged to the family for 6 generations. Charlotte listened in silence. Beside her, she felt her mother's hand tremble slightly before regaining composure. Lady Dorothea suffered from a heart condition, a condition doctors treated with caution and which any emotional shock could worsen. Charlotte swallowed her own tears, locked the despair in a dark compartment of her mind, and focused on what needed to be done. "What are our options, Mr. Crane?" The lawyer enumerated them with the coldness of an inventory. Selling properties that no longer existed, seeking loans that no one would grant, or, and here he paused significantly, an advantageous marriage. Charlotte did not reply. There was nothing to reply. 2 weeks later, on a May afternoon when the London spring had finally decided to manifest itself with blue skies and a gentle breeze, Lady Pemberton, a distant cousin to both the Ashfords and the Fairfaxes, hosted a tea at her residence with the veiled purpose of introducing Edmund Fairfax to Charlotte. Edmund was 45, widowed for 8 years, owner of coal mines in Wales and shipyards in Liverpool. His annual fortune of £12,000 was the product of hard work and commercial vision, not aristocratic inheritance, a fact that London high society never let him forget. He had 2 children from his first marriage, George, 17, and Elizabeth, 14. Charlotte observed him as Lady Pemberton made the introductions. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered with large hands that seemed uncomfortable holding the delicate porcelain teacup. His brown eyes held the expression of one who has seen much of life and learned to accept its imperfections. There was kindness there, Charlotte noted, and an honesty that contrasted with the rehearsed smiles of the aristocrats who courted her for convenience. They conversed about pleasantries, the weather, the social season, the Kensington Gardens. Edmund did not try to impress her with his wealth or diminish her with empty compliments. He spoke of his children with genuine affection, of his late wife Mary with respectful longing, and of his businesses with discreet pride. A week later, he sought her out for a private conversation in the Pembertons' garden under the distant supervision of Lady Dorothea. "Lady Charlotte," he began, and there was something almost apologetic in his voice, "I am not a man for circumlocution. My first wife taught me that honesty is the basis of any lasting relationship, and I intend to honor that lesson." Charlotte waited, her heart sinking with apprehension. "I know of your financial situation. I do not mention it to embarrass you, but because it would be dishonest to feign ignorance. I also know that I have few attractions for a young woman of your standing. I am too old, too recently rich, and I carry the stigma of the merchant in salons that value empty titles over character." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What I can offer is this: security for your family, a comfortable home, and the genuine respect of a man who admires your dignity in the face of adversity. My children need feminine guidance. George is on the verge of becoming a man. Elizabeth is entering a difficult age. I do not ask for love, Lady Charlotte. I ask for an honest partnership between 2 people who can benefit one another." The silence that followed was filled by the song of a blackbird in the garden, the rustling of new leaves on the trees, the distant rumble of carriages on the street. Charlotte looked at Edmund's face, that common face marked by time and work, devoid of Henry's aristocratic beauty, and saw there something that high society rarely offered: sincerity. "I need time to think," she finally replied, "and to speak with my mother." Edmund nodded without any sign of offense or impatience. "All the time you need. I do not desire a reluctant bride, Lady Charlotte. I desire a partner." 3 days of reflection. 3 nights of whispered conversations with Lady Dorothea, of tears shed in secret, of prayers murmured in the private chapel of Ashford Manor. 3 days in which Henry Blackwell's face insisted on appearing in her thoughts, accompanied by those devastating words, "I could never love her." On the 3rd day, Charlotte sent a note to Edmund Fairfax, accepting his proposal. On the 22nd of May, 1881, the engagement announcement was published in the Times and the Morning Chronicle. The wedding was set for the 24th of June. London society reacted with that mixture of veiled scandal and malicious satisfaction that it reserved for unequal marriages. "The Earl's daughter sold to the King of Coal," they whispered in the salons. "Desperation works wonders," others replied. Charlotte heard and did not hear, focused on maintaining the composure that was her armor. What society did not know, what Charlotte would only discover weeks later, was that someone, in silence, was paying debts she knew nothing about, that butcher and pharmacist bills were being settled by an anonymous benefactor, that a specialist doctor from Harley Street had visited Lady Dorothea without any charge reaching Ashford Manor. That urgent repairs to the estate's east roof had been carried out during the night as if by generous ghosts. All payments came from the north through Drummond's Bank, and Charlotte, upon discovering the origin of that money, felt the ground tremble beneath her feet for the 2nd time that spring. The late May mornings brought with them that golden light peculiar to the English spring, hesitant, as if the sun were unsure of its permanence. Charlotte walked through Kensington Gardens with slow steps, pretending to appreciate the tulip beds, while her mind worked frantically. The evidence had accumulated over the weeks like pieces of a disturbing puzzle. First, the butcher's bill. The man swore that a gentleman with a northern accent had paid 3 months' supply in advance. Then the pharmacist with the same story. The Harley Street doctor, a heart disease specialist, who had examined Lady Dorothea and declared his services already covered by an anonymous patron. £200. The roof repairs, £600 in nocturnal work, carried out by a team that vanished as mysteriously as it appeared. The new uniforms for the remaining servants at Ashford Manor. Thousands of pounds poured out in silence, like rain on a thirsty garden. Charlotte was not foolish. The payments came from the north, through Drummond's Bank, the same bank where it was known the Blackwell family kept their accounts for generations. Henry owned properties in Northumberland, in the north of England. The coincidence was too great to ignore. She spotted him before he noticed her. Henry Blackwell was walking along the gravel path circling the ornamental lake, alone, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture she knew well. He wore a dark grey frock coat and a top hat, impeccable as always, but there was something in his shoulders, a tension, an invisible weight, that she did not remember noticing before, or perhaps it had always been there, and she simply had not wanted to see it. Charlotte took a deep breath and walked towards him. Her boots made a soft crunch on the gravel, announcing her approach. Henry looked up, and for a fleeting instant, so brief she almost doubted she had seen it, something crossed his face, something that looked dangerously like pain. Then the mask descended, and he was the Duke of Ravenswood again, cold, distant, impenetrable. Lady Charlotte, his voice betrayed no emotion. I did not know you frequented the gardens at this hour. There are many things you do not know about me, Your Grace. She maintained an equally neutral tone. Just as there are things I did not know about you. Until recently, a muscle twitched in his jaw, a minimal, almost imperceptible sign, but Charlotte noticed it. I do not understand what you are referring to. You understand perfectly. She pulled an envelope from the pocket of her redingote. Inside was a cheque for £300, a symbolic value representing only a fraction of what had been spent. I have come to return this, or at least to begin returning it. Henry looked at the envelope without reaching out to take it. I do not know what you are talking about. The butcher, the pharmacist, the Harley Street doctor, the repairs to Ashford Manor. She enumerated each item with surgical precision. All paid for by a gentleman from the north through Drummond's Bank. I presume you will not deny being that gentleman? The silence that followed was answer enough. Why? The question escaped before Charlotte could contain it. There was pain there, and anger and confusion, all mixed into a single word. Why would you do that? After that night? Henry looked away towards the lake. 2 swans glided across the calm surface, their reflections rippling gently in the dark water. I owe you no explanations, Lady Charlotte. You owe me nothing, she agreed, and her voice trembled despite her efforts. You made that very clear at the Devonshire ball. I could never love her, were your exact words. Very well. I accept your indifference. What I do not accept is your charity. She held out the envelope towards him. Take it, and do not dare to send anything more. I am marrying in 3 weeks, Your Grace, a man who had the decency to offer me respect instead of secret alms. The mention of the marriage caused something to shift in Henry's expression. For a moment, brief, terrible, Charlotte saw the facade crack. There was a storm behind those green eyes, a storm contained for years, decades perhaps, but he did not let her see more than that. Fairfax is a good man, Henry said, and every word seemed to cost him effort. Honest, hard-working, he will treat you well. That is not your concern. No, it is not. He took the envelope from her hands. His fingers brushed hers for an instant, less than a second, and Charlotte felt that touch like an electric shock, like a spark in dry straw. Then Henry tore the cheque into pieces, letting the fragments fall onto the gravel like premature snowflakes. I do not want your money, he said, and there was something almost savage in his voice. I never did. What I did because— He stopped himself, his fists clenched. I did because it needed to be done. There is no debt between us, Lady Charlotte. There never was. Charlotte looked at the pieces of paper at her feet, then at the man before her, the man who had publicly humiliated her, who had said he could never love her, and who was now, inexplicably, secretly funding the rescue of her family. Nothing made sense. And yet, somehow, terribly and wonderfully, everything did. "Who are you, Henry Blackwell?" she whispered. "The man who hurt me at the ball, or the one who pays my debts in the dead of night?" He looked at her then, truly looked at her, without masks, without defenses, and what Charlotte saw in those green eyes made her involuntarily take a step back. There was love there, immense, devastating, desperate love, and there was fear, a fear so profound that it seemed rooted in places where light did not reach. "I am both," he finally said. And that is precisely the problem. Without another word, Henry turned his back and walked away down the gravel path. Charlotte watched him leave, her heart in shreds, her mind in turmoil. There were 4 days until her wedding to Edmund Fairfax, and she had just discovered that the man who swore he would never love her might love her more than any other ever would. The 20th of June, 1881, 4 days before the wedding. The garden party at the Pembertons' residence was one of the last social events of the season, and all of London seemed to have decided to attend. The late afternoon sun bathed the lawns in shades of gold and amber, while ladies in light dresses strolled among rose bushes, and gentlemen in top hats discussed politics and horses under striped awnings. Charlotte felt exposed, like an animal in a display window. Wherever she went, eyes followed her. Some curious, others malicious, all aware that in a few days she would become Mrs. Fairfax, exchanging an aristocratic title for a fortune of commercial origin. The whispers accompanied her like a persistent shadow. Edmund was present, kind as always, introducing her to business associates and their wives with discreet pride. Charlotte played her role with the expected grace, smiling at the right moments, replying courteously to the veiledly insulting comments of the aristocracy. But inside, a restlessness grew. That conversation in Kensington Gardens had planted seeds of doubt that refused to stop germinating. When the opportunity arose, she discreetly moved towards the orchid greenhouse at the back of the property. She needed a few minutes of solitude, a few moments to breathe away from the stares and judgments. The greenhouse was a small paradise of glass and iron, built in the Victorian style with ornate frames and crystal panels that created a world apart. Inside, the air was humid and fragrant, heavy with the sweet scent of the orchids that hung in elaborate arrangements. The late afternoon light filtered through the misted glass, tinging everything in soft shades of pink and gold. Charlotte walked among the pots, letting her fingers brush the delicate petals. There were purple cattleyas, white dendrobiums, phalaenopsis in shades of pink and cream, a collection that Lord Pemberton cultivated with almost religious devotion. The silence there was different from the silence of the garden, more intimate, more welcoming, like a silk embrace. She did not hear the door open behind her. "I always find you among flowers." Henry's voice made her freeze. Her hands, which were caressing a white orchid, trembled involuntarily. "What are you doing here, Your Grace?" "Fleeing." He approached, his steps muffled by the moss carpet that covered the stone floor. "Just like you, I imagine." Charlotte turned to face him. Henry looked different today, or perhaps she was seeing him with different eyes. There were shadows under his eyes, as if he had not slept for days. The aristocratic posture remained impeccable, but something in the stiffness of his shoulders suggested extreme tension, a string about to break. "You should not be here," she said. "If anyone sees us, no one will see us." He gestured towards the glass panels misted by the humidity. "And even if they do, what difference does it make? In 4 days, you will be Mrs. Fairfax. What more can they say that they haven't already said?" The bitterness in his voice was palpable. Charlotte crossed her arms, attempting to create a physical barrier between them. "Say what you came to say and leave." Henry watched her for a long moment. His green eyes seemed darker here, in the perfumed gloom of the greenhouse, like ancient forests where sunlight never penetrated. "I did not come to say anything," he finally admitted. "I came because I could not stay away. Because every time I see you, every time I hear your name or Fairfax's name, something inside me—" He did not complete the sentence. He did not need to. "You do not have that right." Charlotte's voice was firm, but there was a crack there, a fissure that threatened to expand. "You renounced any right when you spoke those words at the ball." "I know." "Then why are you here? Why do you pursue me with your secret charity? Why do you look at me as if—" She stopped herself, her breath accelerating. "As if what?" "As if I were the only thing in the world that matters." The silence that followed was dense as velvet, laden with unsaid words and contained feelings. A drop of condensation ran down the greenhouse glass, tracing a winding path like a tear on a crystal face. Because you are. Henry took another step towards her. They were separated by less than a meter now, close enough for Charlotte to feel the heat emanating from him, the scent of sandalwood and leather from his cologne. You are the only thing that matters, Charlotte, and that terrifies me more than anything has ever terrified me in my entire life. I do not understand. I know you do not understand. He ran a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. You do not know my history. You do not know what happened. Then tell me. The words escaped Charlotte before she could contain them. They were a request, a plea, a bridge extended over the abyss that separated them. Henry closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there was a decision made there. A surrender, perhaps. I was 14, he began, and his voice was like a river carrying debris from an ancient storm. It was summer at Ravenswood Castle. My mother had left 2 weeks before, fled in fact with a French diplomat she had met in London. She left a letter for my father, a letter that destroyed him. Charlotte remained silent, fearing that any word would interrupt that flow of confession. He changed after she left. He did not speak. He did not eat. He spent his days locked in the library with bottles of brandy. I tried to make him come back. But it was like trying to reach someone who is already drowning. A tremor ran through Henry's body, minimal, almost imperceptible, but Charlotte saw it. One August morning, I went to the library to look for him. The door was locked from the inside. I called, I knocked, I begged him to open it. When they finally managed to break it down, his voice failed. He was there, in the armchair by the window, with a letter in his hand, my mother's letter, and a note he had written himself. Charlotte put her hand to her mouth. The note said it was her fault. That love had destroyed him, that he preferred not to exist than to exist without her. Henry looked at Charlotte with eyes that seemed to look through her, to see the past that had never ceased to haunt him. I was 14, Charlotte. 14 when I learned that loving someone means giving that person the power to destroy you. Henry, at 19 I made an oath. He continued as if she had not spoken. I swore I would never allow feelings to govern my reason, that I would never give anyone the power my mother had over my father. I built walls, Charlotte, walls so high and thick that I thought nothing would ever cross them. He took another step towards her. They were now so close that Charlotte could count the golden freckles in his eyes, see the pulse beating in his throat. Then you appeared, at that soiree in January, with your green dress and your eyes that seemed to see through all my defenses, and something I thought was dead began to awaken, something that terrified me more than finding my father in that library. Why did you say those things to me at the ball then? The question was a whisper. If you loved me. Because I love you. The word came out like a confession forcibly extracted. Because I love you, and I do not know how to do it without destroying myself in the process. Because every time I look at you, I see my father's face in that armchair, and I'm afraid of becoming him, or worse, of making you become my mother. Tears now ran down Charlotte's face, tears she had not even realized she had begun to shed. She reached out and touched Henry's face, her fingers brushing the tense line of his jaw. I am not your mother, she said softly, and you are not your father. I do not know that. I do. She held his gaze, letting him see the truth in her eyes. You spent 22 years building walls, Henry. I spent 5 seasons looking for someone who deserved me to climb over them. I found that someone, but he is so busy protecting himself that he cannot see that I pose no threat. I represent salvation. Henry covered her hand with his, pressing it against his face as if it were an anchor in a storm. In 4 days, you are marrying another man. I am. The word was a knife in her own heart. Because I gave my word. Because Edmund has been kind and honest. Because my family needs me. I could... No, she interrupted him before he could finish. I do not want to be rescued, Henry. If you come to me, I want it to be because you chose to tear down your walls, not because you are trying to buy them with money. I want all of you, the broken man as much as the arrogant duke, and I will not settle for less. The sun was setting outside the greenhouse, tinging the world in shades of blood and gold. The orchids around them seemed like silent witnesses to a moment that would change the course of 2 lives. Henry leaned in and rested his forehead against hers, an intimate, desperate gesture, full of everything he could not say in words. I do not know how to do this, he whispered. Then learn. Charlotte closed her eyes. But learn fast, because in 4 days it will be too late. She then pulled away, each step costing her more than she imagined possible. At the greenhouse door she turned one last time. The choice is yours, Henry. It always has been, and she walked out into the golden light of the late afternoon, leaving him alone among the orchids, with the weight of 22 years of fear on his back and 4 days to decide if he would have the courage to free himself. The 23rd of June, 1881, the eve of the wedding. The rain began in the late afternoon and did not stop. It was a classic English rain, persistent, grey, turning the streets of London into rivers of mud and reflections. The windows of the Fairfax residence in Belgravia were illuminated, battling the premature darkness with candlelight and lit fireplaces. The pre-nuptial dinner was an intimate event, only close family and a few selected friends. Charlotte wore champagne-coloured silk, her hair in a simple arrangement adorned with pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. She smiled at the appropriate moments, answered questions with grace, playing the role of happy bride with the skill of a consummate actress. Edmund watched her from across the table, his brown eyes attentive to every nuance of her expression. He was an observant man. He would not have built his fortune without knowing how to read people, and what he read now on his fiancée's face troubled him. After dinner, when the guests dispersed between the drawing-room and the library, Edmund discreetly touched Charlotte's arm. "May we speak, privately?" She nodded, her heart clenching with an undefined foreboding. Edmund's study was a cosy room, lined with books and decorated with nautical maps that hinted at his commercial origins. A fireplace crackled in the corner, spreading golden light and comforting warmth. The rain hammered against the windows like impatient fingers. Edmund gestured to an armchair for Charlotte and sat down opposite her, not behind the desk, a gesture that spoke volumes about his intention to converse as equals, not as a businessman and a client. "Charlotte," he began, using her first name for the first time since they had sealed the agreement, "there is something I need to say before tomorrow." She waited, her hands clasped in her lap. "Mary, my first wife, married me for love. She was the daughter of a Liverpool merchant, without title or fortune, but with a heart so big it lit up any room she entered." His voice was soft, laden with old longing. "We spent 15 years together, 15 years in which I learned what it means to be truly loved and to truly love in return." Edmund paused, looking at the flames in the fireplace as if he saw the face of a long-lost woman there. "When she left, I thought I would never recover. But time, as they say, heals all things, or at least teaches us to live with the wounds. I made peace with my loneliness. I learned to find joy in my children, in my work, in the small blessings of everyday life." He turned his eyes back to Charlotte, and there was a kindness there that made her want to cry. "I did not seek this marriage out of loneliness, Charlotte. I sought it because I saw in you a woman of character, someone who could be a partner and a friend. But," he hesitated, "but I know how to recognize when love exists, even if directed elsewhere." The blood drained from Charlotte's face. "Edmund, you do not need to explain." He raised his hand. "I saw your face when the Duke of Ravenswood entered the Pemberton ball last week. I saw how your hands trembled, how your eyes followed him across the room even when you pretended to look elsewhere. And I saw his face, the same anguish, the same contained desire." Charlotte opened her mouth to protest, but Edmund continued, "I am not a man of dramatic passions, Charlotte. I have no talent for grand romantic gestures, but one thing I learned in my 45 years of life. Marriage without love can work, but marriage with love for another is destined for unhappiness." Tears began to run down Charlotte's face. "I gave my word," she whispered. "My family, your family will be safe regardless of what you decide." Edmund leaned forward. "The payments I made," "Yes, Charlotte, I know about the payments others made too, "were made without conditions. I am not a jailer. I do not trap women in unhappy marriages." "Edmund, let me finish." He took her hands in his, large hands, calloused by work, but infinitely gentle. "If tomorrow you walk down the aisle and say yes, I will be the best husband I can be. I will respect you, I will care for you, I will give you home and security. But if there is any doubt in your heart, any hesitation, I will not be a jailer," he repeated. "No one should start a marriage with a divided heart." Charlotte wept then. She wept as she had not allowed herself to weep since the night of the Devonshire ball. She wept for Edmund and his unwavering kindness, for Henry and his walls of protection, for herself and the impossible choices life placed before her. Edmund let her cry, offering only the silent presence of someone who understands pain without trying to minimize it. When the tears finally ceased, he stood up and walked to the window, watching the rain that continued to fall. "Tomorrow, do what your heart commands," he said without turning around. "Whatever your decision, you will have my respect." Charlotte remained seated in the armchair for long minutes after he left, her face turned towards the fire, the tears drying on her cheeks. On the other side of London, in the Ravenswood residence in Mayfair, Henry Blackwell sat in his study with a sheet of paper before him. The rain beat against the windows as if trying to enter, and the shadows danced on the walls to the uncertain rhythm of the flames. He wrote all night. 12 pages. 12 pages of confession, of memory, of truth finally confronted. He wrote about the morning he found his father, about the smell of gunpowder he could still sense when he closed his eyes. He wrote about the blood-stained note, about the words that had haunted him for 22 years. He wrote about the walls he had built, stone by stone, year after year, until they became as much a part of him as his bones. And he wrote about Charlotte, about the moment he first saw her, with her green dress and her eyes that seemed to know secrets he hid even from himself, about the conversations in the National Gallery, about Turner and light, and the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, about the 3 waltzes at the Marlborough Ball and how for the first time in his adult life he had felt completely present in a moment. He wrote about fear, the paralyzing fear of becoming his father, of loving so much that the loss would destroy him, the fear of giving someone the power to hurt him as his mother had hurt his father, the fear that love was, by definition, the first step towards annihilation. And he wrote about the decision he had made in the last few hours, as the rain washed London and he washed his soul of decades of silence. "If I do not say this now," he wrote on the last page, "I will spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been, and I have already lost too much time living in the might have been instead of the is." At 5:45 on the morning of the 24th of June, 1881, James, Henry's personal servant since childhood, knocked on the door of the Ashford residence in Mayfair. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a washed and brilliant world, as if nature had decided to start anew. He handed the sealed envelope into the hand of Charlotte's maid with precise instructions. It was to be delivered immediately to Lady Charlotte, and only to her. 15 minutes later, Charlotte opened the envelope with trembling hands. 12 pages that would change everything, and in less than 3 hours she would stand at the altar in St. George's Church, Hanover Square, with a decision to make. St. George's Church, Hanover Square, was considered London's most elegant temple for high society weddings. Its Corinthian columns stood majestic beneath the still, damp morning sky, and the stained glass windows filtered the light into kaleidoscopes of colour that danced upon the polished mahogany pews. 120 guests occupied the seats, a sea of top hats and ornate bonnets, of silks and velvets in sober tones appropriate for the occasion. The organ softly played Bach melodies, and the scent of white lilies, Edmund's choice, filled the air with an almost suffocating sweetness. Charlotte waited in the antechamber, her wedding dress falling in cascades of lace and ivory satin. It was a borrowed dress. The family finances did not permit luxuries, but Lady Pemberton had insisted on lending the gown she had worn at her own wedding decades ago. It had been hastily adjusted, and small imperfections were only visible to those who knew where to look. Henry's 12 pages were folded inside her glove, against the skin of her wrist, where she could feel the weight of the paper with every beat of her heart. She had read them 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of pain and love and fear. 3 times until the words were etched into her memory with the permanence of scars. "It is time." Her uncle, Lord Ashford, her father's younger brother, offered her his arm. He was a kind man of little presence but good heart, who had taken on the role of walking her down the aisle in her father's absence. "Are you ready?" She was not. She did not know if she ever would be, but she nodded anyway. The church doors opened, and the wedding march echoed through the stone walls. 120 faces turned towards her, and Charlotte felt the weight of every gaze like hands pushing her forward. She began to walk. The central aisle seemed endless, each step an eternity. To her left, she saw familiar faces. Lady Pemberton with her encouraging smile, Edmund's mother with a cautiously optimistic expression, cousins and aunts and society acquaintances who had attended as much out of curiosity as out of courtesy. To her right, more of the same. Edmund's associates, minor aristocrats, members of the lesser nobility seeking commercial connections, and then, in the last pew, almost hidden in the shadows next to a column, she saw him. Henry Blackwell was standing, his hands clenched by his sides, his face pale as marble. His eyes met hers through the lace veil, and the entire world seemed to stop. Charlotte continued walking, 1 step, 2, 3, At the altar, Edmund waited for her with his gentle smile and his kind eyes. Beside him the vicar with his prayer book. Behind, the arrangements of white lilies he himself had chosen. She reached the middle of the aisle and stopped. The organ continued playing for a few bars before silencing in confusion. Murmurs began to run through the pews like waves in a disturbed lake. Lord Ashford looked at his niece with a perplexed expression. "Charlotte?" She did not answer. Her eyes were fixed on Henry, who remained motionless in the last pew like a pillar of salt. Then, very slowly, Charlotte released her uncle's arm. "Forgive me," she whispered. "I need a moment." She walked to the altar where Edmund was waiting, and ignoring the whispered protests around her, took his hand. "I need to speak with you," she said softly. "In the vestry. Now." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Then, without a word of protest, he accompanied her through the side door that led to the vicar's chambers. The vestry was a small room, smelling of incense and candle wax. Religious vestments hung in oak cupboards, and a narrow window let in a beam of dusty light. Charlotte took the letter from inside her glove and held it out to Edmund. "Read it," she said. "Please." He took the folded pages and began to read in silence. Charlotte watched him, seeing the expressions pass across his face like clouds in a summer sky. Surprise, comprehension, something that was perhaps pain, and finally, something that looked very much like peace. When he finished, Edmund carefully folded the pages and returned them to her. "He loves you," he said simply. "Yes." "And you love him?" It was not a question, but Charlotte answered anyway. "Yes." Edmund sighed, a long sigh of a man who accepts the inevitable. "Then go." Charlotte blinked. "Edmund, go." He took her hands in his for the last time. "Not for him, Charlotte. For you. No one should start a marriage with a divided heart. I said that yesterday, and every word was true." Tears glistened in Charlotte's eyes. "And society, your reputation, my family. Your family will be safe. I have already arranged matters." A sad smile curved his lips. "As for society and your reputation, they are mine to protect. I will go out there and announce that it was I who cancelled the wedding, that I discovered insurmountable incompatibilities, that I take full responsibility. I cannot allow—" "You can, and you will." Edmund squeezed her hands with gentle firmness. "Mary taught me that true love is a rare gift, Charlotte. You do not refuse such a gift for fear of what others will say." He pulled away and walked to the door. "I will speak with the guests. Wait a few minutes and then exit through the back door if you prefer to avoid—" He made a vague gesture that encompassed everything. The scandal, the stairs, the inevitable buzz. "Edmund," Charlotte called him before he left. "Why are you doing this?" He paused with his hand on the doorknob. "Because you deserve to be happy." His voice was simple, without resentment. "And because somewhere up there Mary is smiling that I have done the right thing." And then he was gone, leaving Charlotte alone in the vestry, with a decision already made and a lifetime ahead of her to live it. She did not use the back door. Instead, she waited until she heard Edmund's voice in the sanctuary, explaining to the guests that the wedding would not take place. She waited until the murmurs of shock and indignation swelled and subsided. She waited until her heartbeat calmed enough for her legs to support her. Then she opened the vestry door and walked back into the sanctuary. Henry was still there. He had not moved from the last pew, but his face had changed. There was hope there now, and fear, and a vulnerability she had never seen before. Charlotte walked towards him. Each step echoed in the stone walls, amplified by the silence of 120 people collectively holding their breath. She stopped in front of Henry. She raised the veil from her face, and before all those horrified, fascinated, scandalized witnesses, he kissed her. It was not a chaste kiss, appropriate for a church. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of love contained for too long, finally finding expression. It was a kiss that said everything words could not. When they finally separated, Charlotte smiled, the first true smile in weeks. "You came," she said. "I had no choice." Henry caressed her face with trembling fingers. "I discovered there are walls worth tearing down. And there, in St. George's Church, Hanover Square, under the scandalized eyes of London's high society, Lady Charlotte Ashford chose her destiny. The scandal would be immense. The newspapers would be merciless. Society would judge them relentlessly. But at that moment, with Henry's hand in hers and the taste of his kiss still on her lips, none of that mattered. The newspapers showed no mercy. The fugitive bride of Hanover Square, proclaimed the Morning Chronicle in a front-page headline. Duke steals fiancée at the altar, accused the Daily Telegraph. Scandal at church. Ashford abandons Fairfax for Blackwell, detailed the Times with its customary coldness. For 3 weeks, London spoke of nothing else. In the salons, in the clubs, in the tea-houses, and on the street corners, Charlotte Ashford's name was uttered in malicious whispers or exclamations of indignation. The society matrons shook their heads in disapproval. The young debutantes listened to the story as a warning about the dangers of yielding to romantic passions. Charlotte and Lady Dorothea took refuge at Ashford Manor, away from the curious gaze of London. The estate in Kent, with its neglected gardens and its rooms full of memories, became a sanctuary against the storm raging outside. The first weeks were the hardest. Malicious letters arrived daily, some anonymous, others signed by concerned friends who considered it their duty to point out the magnitude of the mistake made. Charlotte read them with an impassive expression and burned them in the fireplace, one by one, without responding to any. Lady Dorothea, with her fragile health and her heart stronger than it appeared, remained by her daughter's side without ever uttering a word of recrimination. Ashfords endure, she reminded her on the nights Charlotte woke from nightmares filled with judging faces. It is our motto, my dear, and it is not an empty motto. Meanwhile, in London, Henry faced society with the obstinacy of one who has nothing to lose. He frequented his club daily, ignoring the sidelong glances and the conversations that ceased when he entered. He responded to the veiled criticisms with aristocratic coldness, refusing to show shame or regret. But it was Edmund Fairfax who surprised everyone. The week after the cancelled wedding, Edmund appeared at White's Club, a bastion of the London male aristocracy, and faced the questions and innuendos with unwavering dignity. "I prefer to lose a fiancé than to imprison an unhappy woman," he declared loud enough to be heard throughout the room. "Lady Charlotte made a brave choice, and I respect that choice. Anyone who says otherwise in my presence will have to answer to me." The silence that followed was absolute. Edmund did not stop there. In the following days, he made a point of publicly defending both Charlotte and Henry, refusing to feed the scandal with resentment or accusations. His generosity of spirit, his refusal to assume the role of victim, confused a society accustomed to dramas of vengeance and humiliation. "He is a man of rare character," commented Lady Pemberton to Lady Dorothea during one of her visits to Ashford Manor. "He could have destroyed Charlotte's reputation with a word, and instead he protects her as if she were his own daughter." In August, an unexpected letter arrived at Ashford Manor. It bore the seal of the Prince of Wales and invited Henry Blackwell to a private dinner at Marlborough House. The Prince was known for his appreciation of dramatic romances. His own love affairs were a constant source of gossip in the salons. He found in Henry and Charlotte's story exactly the kind of drama he enjoyed: forbidden love, courageous choices, a challenge to conventions. The dinner lasted 4 hours. What was discussed, only Henry and the Prince knew. But when the news of the invitation spread, the tide of public opinion began to turn. If the future King of England considered Henry worthy of his company, who were the minor aristocrats to judge him? In September, Henry began his weekly visits to Kent. He arrived on Friday afternoons in a discreet carriage and stayed until Sunday, courting Charlotte properly, with strolls through the gardens, dinners supervised by Lady Dorothea, shared readings in the library, became his mission. It was a different Henry that Charlotte got to know in those autumn months. The walls he had carried for 2 decades did not disappear overnight, but they were being dismantled, stone by stone, with the patience of one who builds rather than destroys. They conversed for hours about everything and nothing. He told her stories of his childhood at Ravenswood Castle, the good memories he had tried to bury, along with the bad ones. She spoke to him of her dreams, her fears, the books she loved, and the plants she cultivated in the Ashford Manor greenhouse. In October, during a stroll through the apple orchard heavy with ripe fruit, Henry suddenly stopped and took Charlotte's hands in his. "I have a confession to make," he said, and there was vulnerability in his voice. Charlotte waited. "In the last few months, I discovered I was wrong about many things. About my father, about my mother, about what it means to love." He squeezed her hands. "But the most important discovery was this. We spend our lives building defenses against pain, without realizing that by protecting ourselves from pain, we also protect ourselves from joy." An apple fell from a nearby tree, rolling across the grass until it stopped at their feet. "I do not want to protect myself anymore, Charlotte. I want to feel everything, the joy and the pain, the fear and the hope. I want to feel everything as long as it is by your side." She did not reply with words. Instead, she leaned in and kissed him, softly, without the desperate urgency of the kiss in the church, a kiss that promised time, patience, a future built moment by moment. On the 15th of November 1881, Henry Blackwell, Duke of Ravenswood, formally asked for Lady Charlotte Ashford's hand in marriage. He proposed in the Ashford Manor Library, kneeling before Charlotte while Lady Dorothea watched from the doorway with tears in her eyes. He presented her with a ruby ring, a stone red as blood, surrounded by small diamonds, that had belonged to his paternal grandmother. "She was the only woman in my family who had a happy marriage," he explained, as he slid the ring onto Charlotte's finger. "I hope it brings us the same luck." Charlotte looked at the jewel on her hand, then at the man kneeling before her. "Yes," she said simply, and this time there was no doubt in her heart. The 26th of December, 1881, Boxing Day. A light snow had begun to fall over London during the night, blanketing the streets in white and turning the city into a Christmas card landscape. The flakes danced in the cold air, settling gently on rooftops and windowsills, silencing the world with their ephemeral presence. St. James's Church, Piccadilly, was smaller and more intimate than St. George's, and this had been a deliberate choice. Only 30 guests occupied the pews, true friends, family who had remained loyal, people whose presence represented genuine support rather than morbid curiosity. Charlotte wore deep emerald green, the color of Henry's eyes. The dress had been specially made for the occasion, with a bodice embroidered with silver threads that shone like frost in the candlelight. In her hair, instead of a traditional veil, she wore a delicate diamond tiara lent by Lady Pemberton, the same one she had worn at her own wedding ceremony decades ago. There was no pompous wedding march. Charlotte walked down the aisle to the sound of a string quartet playing chamber music, each note softly echoing off the stone walls. By her side, her mother, Lady Dorothea, had insisted on accompanying her, defying conventions that dictated only men should lead brides to the altar. Henry waited for her before the vicar, dressed in strict black with a green silk waistcoat that matched her dress. His eyes had not left Charlotte's from the moment she entered the church, and there was an expression in them that she had never seen before. Peace, true, deep peace, of one who has finally found his place in the world. The vows they exchanged were not the traditional ones. Henry spoke first, his grave voice echoing in the reverent silence. "Charlotte, before these witnesses and before God, I make this promise to you. I will tear down every wall I have built and never again erect another between us. Where there is fear, I will seek courage. Where there is silence, I will seek words. Where there is darkness, I will be your light as you have been mine." He paused, and when he continued, his words were in Latin, the language of eternal oaths, of promises that transcend time and circumstance. "Promitto me tibi in aeternum. I promise myself to you forever." Charlotte felt warm tears run down her face, but she did not bother to wipe them away. "Henry," she began, and her voice did not tremble, "before these witnesses and before God I make this promise to you. I will be your fortress when you forget how to be strong. I will be your memory when the past tries to haunt you. I will be your present when the future seems uncertain." She also switched to Latin. "Semper tecum, semper pro te." Always with you, always for you. The rings were of Welsh gold, simple and elegant, without ornament, besides an inscription engraved on the inside of each one. Semper, always. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Henry kissed Charlotte with a tenderness that made several of the ladies present raise handkerchiefs to their eyes. It was not a kiss of uncontrolled passion like the one at St. George's Church. It was a kiss of promise, of beginning, of two lives finally intertwined. The reception took place at Ravenswood House, Henry's London residence in Mayfair. The salons, normally austere and formal, had been transformed with arrangements of winter flowers, red amaryllis, holly branches, white narcissus that defied the season. Edmund Fairfax was present, as Charlotte and Henry had insisted. He arrived alone, but with a genuine smile that dispelled any discomfort his presence might cause. During dinner, when the toasts were made, Edmund stood up last. "To the bride and groom," he said, raising his glass of champagne. "May they find the happiness they both deserve together, and may they be remembered not for the scandal of their union, but for the courage that united them." The silence that followed was broken by applause, hesitant at first, then sincere. Later, as the snow continued to fall and the guests began to depart, Charlotte found a moment alone with Edmund in the winter garden. "Thank you," she said simply. For everything. For what you did. For what you said. For what you continue to do. Edmund smiled, that kind smile she had learned to recognize. You do not need to thank me. You just need to be happy. He paused. Mary used to say that kindness is the only currency that returns multiplied. Perhaps she was right. Charlotte reached out her hand and squeezed his. You are a good man, Edmund Fairfax. I hope you find someone who deserves that kindness. Perhaps I already have, he said mysteriously, but that is a story for another day. When the last guests left, and the house sank into the silence of the early morning, Charlotte and Henry remained together in the library, sitting before the fire that crackled softly. She rested her head on his shoulder, watching the flames dance. Are you afraid? She asked softly. Henry took a moment to reply. A little, he finally admitted, but it is a different fear. Before, I was afraid to love. Now, I am afraid of not loving well enough. Charlotte turned to face him. You will learn, she said. We will learn together. And there in the library of Ravenswood House, as the snow covered London in white and a new year approached, two wounded hearts began, finally to heal. The year 1882 arrived with promises of a fresh start. The Ravenswood residence in Mayfair, which for years had housed only Henry and his army of silent servants, was transformed under Charlotte's influence. They were not dramatic changes, no grand renovations or complete redecorating. They were subtle, almost imperceptible changes. A vase of fresh flowers at the entrance, embroidered cushions on the library armchairs, lighter curtains that allowed light to enter. It was as if the house, so long plunged into deliberate gloom, was learning to breathe again. Charlotte took over the administration of the home with the same determination she applied to everything in her life. She reviewed accounts, reorganized servants' routines, established mealtimes that had previously been erratic. Henry watched her interventions with a mixture of admiration and astonishment, as if discovering, at 36, that a house could be more than mere shelter from the elements. Lady Dorothea remained at Ashford Manor, whose restoration had finally been completed. The estate in Kent, free of mortgages and debts thanks to the combined generosity of Edmund and Henry, had recovered something of its former splendor. Charlotte visited her mother fortnightly, bringing news from London and taking back old recipes and gardening advice. In March, the couple travelled to Ravenswood Castle in Northumberland. The estate was in the wild north of England, where green hills stretched to the horizon and the wind carried the scent of heather and distant sea. The castle itself was an imposing construction of grey stone, with towers that rose against the sky like fingers pointing to the clouds. There was something austere there, something that spoke of centuries of history and generations of Blackwells who had been born and perished within those walls. It was also the place where Henry had spent his childhood, where he had loved and lost, where he had found his father's body that August morning that had changed everything. Charlotte felt the tension in Henry increase as the carriage approached the gates. His shoulders stiffened, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. She said nothing, merely covered his hand with hers and let the silence speak for her. The library was still the same. They went there on the second day when Henry finally found the courage. The room was large, with floor-to-ceiling shelves, filled with volumes that no one had touched for decades. The armchair by the window, that armchair, had been removed years ago, replaced by a neutral sofa that carried no memories. But the walls remembered, and so did Henry. He stopped in the center of the room, his eyes sweeping every corner as if he expected to see ghosts materialize from the shadows. It was here, he said, and his voice was a rough whisper. Right here that I found him. Charlotte stood by his side, allowing him to process the pain at his own pace. There was blood on the carpet. I remember thinking I thought it was ink, that he had spilled ink from his writing case. A bitter laugh escaped his throat. I was 14. It was easier to believe in spilled ink than... He could not finish. Charlotte enveloped him in her arms, holding him tightly as tremors ran through his body. There were no tears. Henry had cried all his tears long ago, but there was something worse. A dry, ancient pain that was finally finding expression. They stood like that for long minutes, two figures embracing in the center of a library full of ghosts. You do not have to stay here, Charlotte finally said. We can go back to London. We can never set foot in this castle again if that is easier. Henry pulled away enough to look into her eyes. No, he said, and there was determination in his voice. This is my home. It was my home before it became my hell, and it will be my home again. But it needs to be different. It needs to be ours. In the following weeks, Charlotte transformed Ravenswood Castle with the same silent magic she had applied to the London residence. Rooms that had been closed for decades were opened and ventilated. Furniture was rearranged, curtains replaced, bright colors introduced where the dark brown of tradition once reigned. The library was the last to be touched. Charlotte ordered new carpets, light blue instead of the dark red that had absorbed blood so long ago. She brought hothouse plants that she placed by the windows, bringing green life to a space that had only known shades of death. She reorganized the books, creating sections that reflected her own interests alongside Henry's, botany next to history, poetry next to philosophy. When she finished, the library was the same and yet completely different. The walls still remembered, but now they also remembered other things. Afternoons reading side by side, conversations by the fire, a couple building new memories upon the wreckage of old ones. In May, during a stay at the Cornwall estate, the third of Henry's residences, a country house by the sea, Charlotte discovered she was pregnant. The news came with the classic symptoms: morning sickness, occasional dizziness, an exhaustion that no amount of sleep seemed to relieve. The local doctor confirmed her suspicions with a smile and a prescription for rest. Charlotte waited until dinner to tell Henry. They were sitting on the veranda overlooking the sea, watching the sun set over the waves. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and seaweed, and seagulls circled in the orange sky with their sharp cries. "I'm going to be a mother," she said simply, without preambles or circumlocutions. Henry was motionless for an instant, a second that seemed to last an eternity. Then he turned to her, and on his face was something Charlotte had never seen before: pure joy, unreserved, without fear. "I am going to be a father," he whispered, as if testing the words. "I am going to be a father," she smiled. "You will be a good father." "I do not know how to be a father." The old uncertainty appeared in his eyes. Your example was a broken man who did not know how to deal with his own pain," Charlotte interrupted gently. "You are not him, Henry. You never were." He touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, as if memorizing every curve. "I promise to try," he said. "I promise to be better than he was. I promise to—" "Just promise to be present," Charlotte interrupted him. "We will learn the rest together." In June, as they prepared to return to London for the final months of the pregnancy, a letter arrived from Edmund Fairfax. He was engaged. Lady Amelia Thornton was a 38-year-old widow with a 12-year-old daughter, known for her sharp intelligence and irreverent humor. They had met at a charity dinner months before, and Edmund wrote, recognized in each other, "Two souls who have learned that life can surprise even when we think we have seen everything." Charlotte read the letter aloud to Henry, and when she finished, both were smiling. "We must send a gift," Charlotte said, "something special." "And a letter," Henry added, "expressing our sincerest wishes." It was strange, Charlotte thought, as she drafted the congratulatory message. A year earlier, Edmund Fairfax was her fiancé. Now he was her husband's friend, and she genuinely celebrated his happiness with another woman. Life, indeed, was surprising. The 2nd of February, 1883. The night had been long, very long. 6 hours of labor that felt like 6 years, 6 centuries, 6 eternities compressed into shouts and sweat and murmured prayers. Henry remained outside the room. The conventions of the time did not allow husbands to witness the birth of their children, but his presence was felt through the walls. He paced the corridor like a caged animal, his steps echoing on the wooden floor, stopping only when a sharper cry penetrated the closed door. The doctor had called for reinforcements. The midwife had frowned more than once. Whispered phrases: "difficult position, needs to turn, prepare more cloths," reached Henry's ears like fragments of a nightmare. He thought of his father. He could not avoid it. He thought of the mother who had abandoned him, the man who had destroyed himself for love, the curse that seemed to weigh upon the Blackwell family, and he was afraid. A fear so intense that he felt his legs weaken. If he lost Charlotte now, if fate were cruel enough to take from him the only person he had managed to truly love. A hand touched his shoulder. Lady Dorothea was there, pale but composed, having travelled from Kent as soon as she learned that labour had begun. "She is strong," his mother-in-law said with the firm voice of one who has faced worse storms. "Stronger than you think. Ashfords endure, remember." Henry nodded, unable to find words. Another hour passed. And then, as the early morning gave way to the grey dawn of February, a different sound penetrated the door. A baby's cry, strong, indignant, vigorous. The cry of a child arriving in the world, protesting the inconvenience of birth. Henry felt the tears before he realized he was crying. The doctor left the room minutes later. his face tired but smiling. "A boy," he announced. "Healthy, strong, almost 4 kilos. The Duchess is exhausted, but well. You may enter." Henry entered. Charlotte was leaning back against the pillows, her hair damp with sweat clinging to her forehead, her face paler than he had ever seen. But she was smiling, a weak, exhausted but genuine smile. And in her arms was a small bundle of white cloths. "Come meet your son," she said, her voice hoarse from shouting. Henry approached the bed with hesitant steps, as if walking on glass that might break at any moment. He sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at the tiny face emerging from the cloths. It was red and wrinkled, with a dark fuzz on top of his head and clenched fists that punched the air with indignation. His eyes were closed, but his mouth moved in search of something. Nourishment, comfort, the warmth of the mother's body. "William," Charlotte said. "William Edward Blackwell. Will, for short." Henry reached out a finger and touched his son's tiny hand. The baby's fingers closed around his with surprising strength, as if refusing to let go. And something inside Henry, something that had been cracked for 22 years, finally healed. "Will," he repeated, and his voice was pure wonder. "My son, my Will." The following weeks were a whirlwind of sleepless nights, changed nappies, and crying that seemed endless. Charlotte recovered slowly. The difficult birth had left her body fragile, and doctors insisted on absolute rest. Henry, to the surprise of everyone including himself, took on responsibilities that no duke of his time would dare to assume. He woke up during the night to check the cradle, learned to hold the baby in his arms, and even tried, with little success, to soothe the nocturnal cries while Charlotte slept. "You should leave that to the nurses," Lady Dorothea said during one of her visits, watching Henry walk around the room with Will in his arms. "I probably should," he agreed without stopping his pace, "but I do not want to." "Why?" Henry looked at the sleeping face of his son, that face that was his own face in miniature, but also Charlotte's, in a perfect fusion of both. "Because my father never held me like this," he said simply, "and I do not want Will to grow up without knowing what it is like." Lady Dorothea smiled, and there were tears in her eyes. "Charlotte chose well," she murmured. In March, when Charlotte was recovered enough to receive visitors, Edmund Fairfax came to meet the baby. He brought with him an elaborate gift, a polished mahogany rocking horse, specially commissioned for the occasion, and a smile that did not hide his joy. "He has your eyes," Edmund said to Henry as he watched Will sleep in the cradle. "But the stubborn chin is all his mother's." Henry laughed, a sound that 2 years earlier would have seemed impossible coming from him. "We hope he inherits her intelligence too." "And the temper," Charlotte added from the sofa where she rested. "The Blackwells are known for their temper." Edmund stayed for tea, and during the conversation, Charlotte made the invitation she and Henry had discussed in the previous weeks. "We would like you to be Will's godfather." Edmund was silent for a moment, visibly moved. "Are you sure?" he finally asked. "After everything." "After everything," Henry interrupted. "You proved yourself a more loyal friend than many we have known for decades. If anyone deserves to be in our son's life, that someone is you." Edmund accepted with a handshake that said more than any words. And so at the baptism of William Edward Blackwell, held in the chapel of Ravenswood House in April 1883, Edmund Fairfax stood beside the font, holding a lit candle as the vicar poured holy water over the baby's forehead. It was an image that would have been unthinkable a year earlier, the jilted ex-fiancé serving as godfather to the child of the man who had replaced him. But life, as Charlotte had learned, rarely followed the scripts we imagine for it, and sometimes the most improbable chapters were also the most beautiful. The spring of 1883 brought with it the joy of watching Will grow, a baby who quickly transformed into a curious child, with green eyes like his father and a determined temperament like his mother. He crawled through the corridors of Ravenswood House with unwavering determination, grasping furniture to pull himself up and taking his first wobbly steps under the proud gazes of his parents. In July, Henry and Charlotte celebrated their first wedding anniversary with a trip to Italy, his gift to her, secretly planned for months. Will stayed in Lady Dorothea's care at Ashford Manor, where he was spoiled beyond all reasonable measure. Florence, Rome, Venice. 3 weeks touring cities Charlotte knew only from books, admiring works of art that until then were just dusty reproductions in library volumes. They walked across the bridges over the Arno at sunset, contemplated the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel hand in hand, glided through Venetian canals in gondolas while serenades echoed over the water. It was on this trip that Charlotte realized Henry's complete transformation. The man she had known 2 years earlier, cold, distant, hidden behind impenetrable walls, had given way to someone who laughed openly, who held her hand in public, who fell asleep with his head on her lap during long train journeys. The walls had fallen, not all at once, but stone by stone over months of shared life, of trust built, of love shown in small, everyday gestures. In October, an unexpected honor arrived, an invitation to a private dinner with Queen Victoria at Balmoral. The Queen, still mourning Prince Albert after more than 20 years, rarely received guests at her Scottish residence, but stories of love touched her, perhaps reminding her of what she had lost, and Henry and Charlotte's story had reached her ears through channels no one dared to question. The dinner was an experience Charlotte would never forget. The Queen, short and plump in her eternal widow's black, proved surprisingly accessible and even warm. She asked about Will with genuine interest, commented on Henry's properties with detailed knowledge, and at the end of the evening, as the ladies retired to leave the gentlemen with their cigars, she pulled Charlotte aside. "True love is a rare gift," the Queen said, her dark eyes shining with an ancient sadness. "Do not waste it with pride or fear. I would give everything for one more day with my Albert. Everything." Charlotte never forgot those words. The winter of 1883 and the spring of 1884, however, brought challenges that tested the strength of their marriage. Will's difficult birth had left marks on Charlotte, not visible, but real. Doctors advised caution, spoke of risks, suggested that perhaps the family was complete with a single heir. Henry internalized these warnings in a way Charlotte had not foreseen. He became overprotective, almost obsessive. He did not want her to travel, did not want her to exert herself, did not want her to do anything that might pose a risk to her health. At first, Charlotte interpreted this concern as an expression of love, but as the months passed, the protection began to feel like imprisonment. The confrontation happened on a March night in 1884, after Henry once again vetoed a trip Charlotte had planned to visit Lady Dorothea. "I cannot do this anymore," she said, her voice firm but trembling with emotion. "I cannot live like this, Henry, locked in this house like a porcelain doll that might break at any moment. I am only trying to protect you. You did not save me to imprison me." The words came out harsher than Charlotte intended, but they were true. "You spent 20 years hiding behind walls, and now you want to put me behind yours. I will not accept it. I will not." The silence that followed was dense, laden with unsaid words and unconfessed fears. "I am afraid of losing you," Henry finally admitted, and his voice was that of a frightened child. "I am afraid of waking up one day and you not being here anymore. I am afraid of becoming your father," Charlotte completed softly. "Of loving so much that the loss destroys you." "Yes." Charlotte crossed the distance between them and took his face in her hands. "Listen, Henry. Listen carefully." Her eyes held his with unwavering intensity. "I cannot promise that I will live forever. No one can promise that. But I can promise this. Every day we have together will be truly lived. Not in the shadow of fear, not in the prison of overprotection. Truly lived with joys and risks and everything that makes life worthwhile." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Your father did not destroy himself because he loved too much. He destroyed himself because he did not know how to process the pain when love failed. You are not him. You have learned to process, to heal, to move forward. Trust that. Trust us." That conversation marked a turning point. Henry did not change overnight. Old fears do not disappear that easily. But he began to consciously work against his impulses to control. He allowed Charlotte to travel, to make decisions about her own health, to live instead of just exist. Lady Dorothea, who had visited during the marital crisis, was instrumental in the mediation. Her private conversations with Henry, about what it means to love without suffocating, about the difference between protection and imprisonment, helped illuminate dark corners he did not know still existed. In March 1884, Edmund Fairfax married Lady Amelia Thornton in an intimate ceremony in Liverpool. Charlotte and Henry served as maid of honor and best man, returning the honor Edmund had granted them the previous year. And in December 1884, Charlotte gave birth again. Rosalind Dorothea Blackwell, Rose as she soon came to be called, was born in a surprisingly smooth labor, almost as nature's apology for the difficulty of the first. She was a dark-haired, almond-eyed girl who would prove in time to be as stubborn as her mother. Will, at 2 years old, was unsure what to do with this noisy creature, who stole his parents' attention. But when Rose grasped his finger with her tiny fists and smiled, probably just gas, but Will preferred to believe it was for him, something changed. "My sister," he said with all the seriousness of his 2 years. "Mine." And so, the Blackwell family was complete. Spring of 1885. A letter arrived one spring morning, as the daffodils began to bloom in the Ravenswood House gardens, and London prepared for another social season. The seal was French, the paper perfumed, the handwriting elegant, but trembling. Henry recognized the script, even before opening the envelope. Lady Georgiana Blackwell, his mother, wrote from Nice in the south of France. The French diplomat with whom she had fled 21 years earlier had passed away, leaving her penniless. She pleaded to see her son, to meet the grandchildren she had never encountered. Henry read the letter in silence, his face turned to stone. When he finished, he carefully folded the paper and put it in his waistcoat pocket without saying a word. Charlotte found him hours later in the library, sitting in the armchair she herself had chosen to replace the old one, his eyes fixed on nothing. "What happened?" she asked, kneeling before him. He showed her the letter. Charlotte read slowly, weighing every word. When she finished, she looked up at her husband. "Will you reply?" "No." The answer was immediate, automatic. "She forfeited the right to be my mother when she abandoned my father, when she abandoned me." Charlotte did not argue, not at that moment. She had learned over 3 years of marriage that certain conversations needed to ripen before being harvested. A week passed. Henry did not mention the letter again, but Charlotte saw the signs, the restless nights, the distraction during meals, the way his eyes drifted to the horizon when he thought no one was watching. On an April evening, when the children were asleep and the house had fallen silent, Charlotte addressed the subject. "You need to see her," she said simply. Henry looked up from the book he was pretending to read. "Charlotte, not for her." She sat down beside him on the sofa. "For you. As long as you do not confront this ghost, it will continue to haunt our marriage. I have already forgiven her." "Forgiven?" Charlotte held his gaze. "Or just pushed the pain into a corner where you did not have to look at it?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "What are you afraid will happen if you see her?" Charlotte asked softly. "I do not know." Henry ran a hand over his face in a gesture of exhaustion. "I am afraid of hating her. I am afraid of not feeling anything. I am afraid of finding out that I blamed her for something that perhaps was not entirely her fault," Charlotte completed. Henry's eyes met hers, and there was a vulnerability there that made him look again like the 14-year-old boy who had found his father in the library. "My father was not a saint," he whispered, as if confessing a terrible secret. "I know that now. He was a cold, controlling man who treated my mother like a possession instead of a person. But when he died, when I found the note blaming her, it was easier to hate her than to face the truth. And what is the truth? That my father chose death." The word came out like a confession forcibly extracted, that no one forced him to do what he did, that blaming my mother was easier than accepting that he simply was not strong enough to continue. Charlotte enveloped him in her arms, holding him as decades of pain finally found expression. In May, Henry traveled to London to meet Lady Georgiana, who was staying at the Savoy Hotel with the little money she had left. The woman who awaited him in the tea lounge was a shadow of the one he remembered. At 56, Georgiana Blackwell carried the marks of a life of exile, deep wrinkles around her eyes, grey hairs that had once been black like his, hands that trembled when she raised the cup to her lips. There were no hugs. There were no tears. Just two strangers sitting face to face, separated by 21 years of silence. "I did not come to ask for forgiveness," Georgiana finally said. "I know I do not deserve it." Henry did not reply. He waited. "I just want to explain, not justify. Explain." She paused, gathering strength. "I married your father at 17. It was an arranged marriage, like all marriages in those days. He was 20 years older than me. He was rich, he was powerful. He was everything my family desired for me. And did you love him? I loved what he represented. Security, position, a guaranteed future." A sad smile curved her lips. "But love came later, or at least it tried to come. But your father did not know how to receive it. To him I was a trophy, not a person. Proof of his standing, not a companion in his life." She looked out the hotel window, perhaps seeing the past reflected in the glass. "The diplomat, Jean-Pierre, was the first person in 20 years of marriage to look at me as if I existed, as if my opinions mattered, as if my feelings had value." Her voice trembled. It was wrong, I know it was wrong, but I was so desperate to be seen that you abandoned your son." Henry's words were sharp, but not cruel. They were a statement of fact, not an accusation. Georgiana closed her eyes. "Yes, and there is no excuse for it. None. You were a child, you needed a mother, and I chose my own happiness over your safety." When she opened her eyes again, there were tears there. "I do not expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know the truth, the whole truth." The meeting lasted 2 hours. When Henry left, there was no complete reconciliation. Wounds that large do not heal in an afternoon. But there was something new, understanding. The understanding that villains and victims are rarely as clearly defined as we would like, and that the pain we inflict on others often stems from the pain we carry within ourselves. In June, Henry and Charlotte made a joint decision. Georgiana would be allowed to correspond with the grandchildren and visit them once a year, under supervision. It would not be complete forgiveness, but it would be a start. "Why are you doing this?" Georgiana asked when Henry communicated the decision to her. "After all I did." Henry looked at the woman who was his mother, and for the first time in 21 years, felt more than just anger. "Because my children deserve to know all their grandparents," he said, "and because I learned that carrying resentment is like drinking poison, hoping the other person will die. I am tired of drinking poison." Georgiana left for Bath shortly afterwards to live with a cousin who had offered to take her in. The letters she exchanged with Will and Rose, dictated by Charlotte, as the children were still too young to write, became a point of light in her solitary existence, and Henry finally was able to look at the past without feeling like it was swallowing him whole. Spring of 1888. 7 years had passed since that ball in the Duchess of Devonshire's salons, since the cruel words that almost destroyed everything before it began. 7 years of patient building, of walls torn down, of love cultivated day after day, like a garden that requires constant attention. Will, at 5 years old, was a child of insatiable curiosity and natural kindness. He had inherited his father's green eyes and his mother's determined chin, a combination that promised to turn him into a formidable young man. He spent hours in the Ravenswood House library, flipping through illustrated books about animals and plants, asking questions that challenged the patience of tutors far less imaginative than he was. Rose, at 3 years old, was a force of nature compacted into a tiny body. Stubborn like her mother, tempestuous like her maternal grandfather was said to have been, she commanded the house with an iron fist disguised in velvet gloves. The servants adored her. Henry spoiled her beyond reason, and Charlotte, who saw an amplified version of herself in Rose, alternated between pride and exhaustion. The family divided their time between the 3 properties: London during the social season, Northumberland in the summer, Cornwall in the autumn. It was a privileged life, certainly, but Henry and Charlotte made sure their children understood the weight of that responsibility. That privilege implied duty, that fortune should be accompanied by generosity. In January 1888, Lady Dorothea passed away peacefully on a winter night at Ashford Manor and did not wake up. She was 63, and the weak heart that doctors had monitored for decades finally gave way. The maid found her in the morning, serene as if merely sleeping, a book still open on her chest, a volume of poetry Charlotte had given her the previous Christmas. The news reached London in the middle of the night, brought by a messenger on horseback. Charlotte received it in silence, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped in her lap as Henry read the telegram aloud. There was no immediate crying. The pain was too great for tears, too deep for expression. Charlotte remained motionless for long minutes, processing the loss of the woman who had been her rock, her anchor, her silent strength in the most difficult moments. "She did not suffer," Henry said softly, sitting beside his wife. "She went in peace." Charlotte nodded, still unable to speak. "I will arrange the trip to Kent," he continued. "The children can stay with—" "No." The word came out rough, but firm. "I want them to come. I want them to say goodbye to her. I want them to remember." The funeral was held 3 days later, in the small stone church that had served the Ashford community since medieval times. Light snow fell on the cemetery as they lowered the coffin into the ground, settling gently on old gravestones and winter flowers. Charlotte inherited Ashford Manor. The estate she had almost lost 7 years earlier was now hers, debt-free, restored to something close to its former splendor. She spent a week there after the funeral, walking through the rooms full of memories, touching objects her mother had touched, breathing the air that still seemed laden with her presence. On the last night before returning to London, Charlotte sat in the winter garden that Lady Dorothea had loved so much. The plants, orchids, ferns, jasmine, continued to flower under the misted glass, oblivious to the departure of the one who had cultivated them. Henry found her there, wrapped in a wool shawl, her eyes dry but red from contained tears. "She would be proud of you," he said, sitting down beside her. Charlotte smiled sadly. "She always was, even when I doubted myself. That is what mothers do, is it not?" Henry took her hand in his. "They believe in us when we forget how to believe in ourselves." Charlotte leaned back against him, letting his warmth comfort her. "I will miss her every day for the rest of my life. I know, but she is at peace now with father wherever he is." Charlotte sighed. "And I have you. I have the children. I have a life she helped build." Henry kissed the top of her head. "Ashfords endure," he murmured. "Ashfords endure," Charlotte repeated, and there was strength in her voice. The strength of generations of women who learned to bend without breaking. In March, Edmund and Amelia Fairfax visited with their growing family. In addition to Amelia's daughter from her first marriage, now a 17-year-old young woman, the couple had been blessed with 2 girls of their own, 3-year-old twins who made Rose seem well-behaved by comparison. The children played together in the Ravenswood house gardens, while the adults talked on the terrace, watching them with the eyes of proud and exhausted parents. "Who would have thought," Edmund commented, smiling, "that we would end up like this, you and I sitting together watching our children play?" Henry raised his glass of lemonade in a silent toast. "Life surprises. It truly does." Edmund looked at Amelia, who was talking with Charlotte on the other side of the terrace, and his face softened with evident love. "Mary used to say that God writes straight with crooked lines. I do not think I truly understood what that meant until now. I do not think any of us did." The men were silent for a moment, watching the children run across the lawn, Will leading the group with the authority of the eldest, Rose commanding with the stubbornness of the most headstrong, the Fairfax twins causing chaos wherever they went. "Thank you," Henry finally said. Edmund looked at him with an interrogative expression. "For what?" "For not hating me. For defending Charlotte when I did not have the courage to do it publicly. For—" Henry paused, searching for words. "For being a better man than I deserved you to be." Edmund considered the statement for a moment. "It was not easy," he admitted. "In the first few months I confess there were nights when I cursed your name." A wry smile curved his lips. "But Mary always said that resentment is an anchor that prevents us from sailing to better waters. I chose to release the anchor and found better waters." Edmund looked at Amelia again, whose crystalline laughter carried across the terrace. "I found an entire ocean." June 1888. Ravenswood Castle stood majestic against the blue sky of the Northumbrian summer. The castle that had been the stage for so many tragedies, suicide, abandonment, decades of loneliness, had been transformed over the last 7 years into something completely different, a home. The gardens, once abandoned to neglect, now bloomed with the plants Charlotte had cultivated, with the patience of a passionate botanist. Climbing roses covered the grey stone walls, softening their austerity. Lavender beds perfumed the summer air, and in the centre of the main lawn, where nothing grew before but weeds and melancholy, a new element had been added, a young oak tree. Charlotte and Henry had planted the sapling together, in a private ritual performed on the morning of their 7th wedding anniversary. The children watched with the solemnity that children can maintain, approximately 3 minutes, before running off to play in the gardens. The bronze plaque at the foot of the tree read, "Planted in 1888 by the Duke and Duchess of Ravenswood, that future generations may rest in its shade." It was a tree that neither of them would see in its fullness. Oaks take centuries to reach maturity, and even optimists like Charlotte and Henry did not expect to live that long. But that was precisely the point. It was a promise to the future, an act of faith that there would be a future. Generations of Blackwells who would come after them, who would climb those branches, who would read the names of ancestors on the bronze plaque and wonder about their stories. At dusk, when the children were finally asleep and the house had fallen silent, Henry and Charlotte returned to the garden. The young oak was just a sapling, fragile and hopeful, its new leaves trembling in the evening breeze. The sun set over the Northumbrian hills, tinging the sky in shades of pink and gold, and the air carried the sweet perfume of summer roses. They sat on the grass at the foot of the tree, side by side, as they had sat so many times over the years, in different gardens, under different skies, but always together. "Do you remember what you promised at the altar?" Charlotte asked, her head resting on her husband's shoulder. "To tear down every wall and never again erect another between us." Henry smiled. I remember every word. And did you keep it? He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think so, or at least I tried. He paused. There were moments when the old instincts wanted to take over, moments when fear tried to convince me to retreat, to protect myself, to raise the defenses again. And what did you do in those moments? I remembered you. He kissed the top of her head. I remembered that there was someone on the other side of the wall who was worth the risk of letting it fall. Charlotte raised herself to look into his eyes, those green eyes that had captivated her 7 years earlier at a musical soirée, that had wounded her at a season-opening ball, that had saved her with 12 pages of confession on the eve of a wedding that did not happen. I love you, she said simply. I love the man you were when I met you, cold, frightened, hidden behind walls, and I love the man you have become, open, courageous, present. I love every version of you, Henry Blackwell, past, present, and future. Henry touched her face, his fingers tracing lines he had memorized years ago but never tired of rediscovering. When I first saw you at that soirée, he said, and his voice was a whisper of reverence, something I thought was dead began to awaken. I told you that in the orchid greenhouse, remember? I said it terrified me. I remember. It no longer terrifies me. He smiled, that rare smile she had learned to cultivate over the years. I discovered that there are worse things than loving and losing. There is living without ever having loved. There is building walls so high that no light can enter. There is dying without ever having truly lived. Charlotte took his hands in hers. Hodie, cras, semper, she said in Latin. Today, tomorrow, always. Hodie, cras, semper, he repeated, and there, under the young oak that would one day shade generations yet unborn, they renewed the vows they had made 7 years earlier, not with ceremony or witnesses, not with rings or documents, only with words whispered at dusk, promises renewed in the silence of a garden that had witnessed the transformation of 2 wounded souls into something greater than the sum of their parts. The sun set. The stars began to appear one by one, like candles lit in an infinite cathedral, and Henry and Charlotte remained seated on the grass, hands intertwined, contemplating the darkening sky and the future that stretched out before them, uncertain like all futures, but full of possibilities. Years later, when their hair was grey and their steps slower, they would return to this garden. They would sit under the oak that would have grown by then, strong enough to provide shade. And they would remember this night, this June night in 1888, when 2 hearts that had learned to heal swore to continue healing each other day after day, year after year, until there were no more days to count, because that was what love meant after all. Not the absence of fear, but the courage to love despite it. Not the promise of perfection, but the commitment to grow together. Not the end of pain, but the discovery that there is someone willing to carry it with you. Semper. Always. On the castle veranda, a figure watched the couple in the garden. Lady Georgiana Blackwell, on her annual visit to her grandchildren, had come downstairs to say goodnight to the children and had found the scene she now contemplated. Her son, that boy she had abandoned so many years ago, who had grown up motherless, who had carried the weight of his father's suicide on his shoulders for 2 decades. That boy was now a man, a husband, a father, someone who had learned to love despite everything he had been taught about the danger of loving. There was redemption there, not for her. Some things cannot be redeemed, but for him, for the family he had built, for the legacy he would leave behind. Georgiana smiled through her tears and quietly went back inside the castle, leaving the couple to their intimacy. Tomorrow there would be family breakfast, children's laughter, conversations about nothing and about everything. Tomorrow life would continue with its usual mix of joys and challenges. Tomorrow would bring new pages to be written in the history of the Blackwells. But tonight belonged to Henry and Charlotte, to them and to the love they had built against all odds. To them and to the young oak that would grow with its roots planted in this soil where so many tears were shed, and where so many more would be shed in the future, but this time, tears of joy. To them and to the promise whispered at dusk, Semper always.